guys, welcome back to this episode of the Life Podcast. It's been a while. I'm here, Mike Peterson. If you're listening to this episode is for you. I'm excited to be back. Life's been busy, it always is, but here I am, and I'm recording a podcast. I'm excited about it. It's February 2024. Let's get after it. All right. Hey, today on the podcast, and here's the thing about the podcast for me is, and I'm just kind of jumping over the place right now, but I just do this for fun. So when I get the time to do it, I do it. If I don't have the time, I don't do it. So here I am. I got some time. I'm making a podcast episode. Here's what I want to talk about today on the podcast. In January of this year, I went through a series in my youth ministry. And the way that I do series in my youth ministry is every month I take a theme or a passage or a book or a topic and preach on it for that month. And then at the end of the month, we do small groups. We discuss it in our small groups. So today I want to, and for the next couple episodes, I want to take you through those first, the three messages that I preached in January. And it was all surrounding the topic and theme of rocks in the Bible. I know, super exciting. All about rocks. I didn't have a name for this series. I mean, I picked stories that involved rocks, and then I went for it. So there's a lot of different stories I could have used, but I'm going to give you three stories. Not all today. I'll do one, and then another episode, another. Okay, today, I got today's story from Joshua chapter 3 and chapter 4, and this story is probably my favorite one out of the three that I preached in January. And I'm calling this a rock to remember. A rock to remember. The story goes, I'm not going to read you the story. I will just summarize the story for you in Joshua. Joshua is now leading God's people, the Israelites, into the promised land. They're about to cross the river Jordan. And just like God did for Moses, he splits the river. They walk through on dry ground. There's people carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they stand in the middle of this river on dry ground as the entire population of Israelites are walking through this river. As they go through, God gave Joshua the command to tell one person from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to go back to the middle of the riverbed and to grab a rock and to bring it to the other side. And they would use these rocks to set up a memorial for what God has done for the Israelites. So each tribe appointed one person. They went and grabbed a rock. They brought this rock out. They essentially built a memorial. And specifically what was said in this passage was, when your children ask, you can tell them what I've done. I love this story, and I'll segue it this way. Have you ever gotten a souvenir from somewhere? Maybe you go to vacation, you buy little keychains, you buy hats, you buy t-shirts, but every place you go, it's got a souvenir shop because these places want you to remember where you've been. They want you to know what the experience was like. They want you to remember all the emotions that you once felt. Here's what my mom did growing up. My mom collected rocks everywhere that we went. We'd be driving down the highway going 90 miles an hour, and she'd slam on the brakes and be like, I see a rock on the side of the road. I want that rock. And of course, my brother and I are like, whatever. But oftentimes my mom would grab like the most massive rocks, and it was just ridiculous. I'd be in like third grade, and I weighed like 50 pounds, and she'd be like, Austin, I want you to carry this rock. And I'm like, Mom, this rock is literally the size of me. Like, I can't lift this thing. And so my she's got like an entire rock garden from rocks she's picked up all over the United States and places that she's been. She even labels them, like on the bottom of them, it'll say where they've been. There's one from South Dakota. There's one from the Zion National. Like, they're from all over the place. I don't even know if you're allowed to take rocks, but she is, and it's fine. But everywhere my mom goes, she gets a rock. And to her, it's not just a rock. You know how like the SpongeBob episode, it's not just a boulder, it's a rock. Like, to my mom, it's not just a rock. This rock has memories with it. It has experiences with it. Like, if I look at this rock from South Dakota, I remember this vacation very vividly. We went to Mount Rushmore. We went to some caves over there. went to this place called Flintstone Land. Went to a place called Reptile Gardens. Literally, when I look at this rock, all those memories come flooding back to me. All from a rock. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, but this is kind of the idea of the passage, that when the Israelites would look upon this rock, it would serve as a reminder for what God did for them and for what God will continue to do for them in the future. So the idea of this message that I preached at youth was simply this. you need rocks to remember in your walk with God. Do you want to know why so many young people walk away from the faith? It is because they do not have their own experiences and their own memories and their own times with God. They have nothing to look back on and to grasp onto and to say, I remember when God did this. I remember when God spoke this to me. I remember this moment. Like, they don't have any of those rocks and those memories to hold on to. What keeps us going in ministry, what keeps me going in ministry is I have very definite moments in my life where I can say, God called me, God did this. And in the moments when I'm doubting and thinking all these crazy thoughts, I can look back and say, no. I remember when God spoke this word to me, when God did this for me, and it sustains me where I'm at. So I think that we should be rock collectors. I think that we as Christians should be people of remembrance and picking up rocks everywhere we go. The first point I made was this, that we need to be rock collectors. You need to be a rock collector, and here's what I mean. Everywhere you go, you need to look for what God is doing and look for what God has done. It was common practice in ancient Hebrew culture to set up altars, to set up memorials after God did something significant. In Genesis chapter 35, Jacob set up a pillar in the place where God spoke to him and changed his name. The Passover is an entire holiday of remembering God delivering the Israelites. Christmas and Easter are times of remembrance of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and of course of his birth. One of the most important things we can do as Christians is to remember all that God has done for us. And I even think about being a rock collector. It can be the antidote to so many things. If you're depressed, you can remember all the things that God has done for you, the joy that God has brought you, the things that, if you're anxious, remember those times that God provided for you. If you're fearful, remember the times that God has protected you and provided for you. But here's the thing about being a rock collector. It's easy to miss rocks if you're not looking for them. If you're not looking for something, odds are you won't find it. In my mom's case, the only reason she has an entire collection, I'm talking thousands of rocks. My mom has thousands of rocks because she is constantly scoping and looking for rocks. When we're on a vacation, she's looking along the sides of the highways. She's looking in the mountains. She's looking on the side. She's looking everywhere for these rocks. If one catches her eyes, she's like, I found it. I think a lot of times we don't have rocks to look back on and rocks to remember in our walk with Jesus simply because we're not looking for them. You need to look for them. It's kind of like if you ever have somebody that gets a new car or somebody, let's say you're looking to get a new car and you're like, I want to get a 2015 yellow Volkswagen Beetle. Like, that's an awful car to get, but all of a sudden you start seeing them all over the place, right? If you're looking for that particular thing, it's like all of a sudden I am seeing them everywhere. Not because any more have popped into existence, it's because you're looking for them. And what you're looking for, you're going to see. So if you want to look for God doing something and God moving in your life, I guarantee you, sometimes you just need to shift your focus to looking to the very thing you want to see, if that makes sense. And I think many of us, we've actually contributed what God has done to luck, to our own work, to our own labors, to coincidence, to good karma. And that's just not the case. I think, like, let me give you an example. At the beginning of the year in 2024, I wanted to go on a fast, and I've been thinking about fasting, and I went to this church. I was up in Coeur d'Alene. I went to a church over there, and they were talking about fasting as they were going into the new year. Now, I could have said this. I could have said, well, of course they were talking about fasting. It's the new year. Everybody fasts in the new year. Or I changed my perspective, and I'm like, well, I've been thinking about fasting. I've been praying about fasting. Could this be a confirmation in my life that God wants me to fast? So maybe I need to stop attributing to coincidence, to luck, to my own works, and start attributing the things in my life that are happening to God. Maybe that was God trying to speak to me, and I just need to switch my perspective in it. Does that make sense? I think we need to be, as Christians, we need to be rock collectors. We need to be on the lookout for things that God is doing, for the way God is protecting us, for the way God is moving, we need to be people who are looking for what God is already doing. Okay. Second point I want to make is this. Number 2, if we're going to collect rocks, that's great, but we must reflect on the rocks. Point number 2, we must reflect on the rocks, because collecting rocks is useless unless you reflect on them. If you just have them, like in my mom's house, she keeps all these rocks on shelves in a rock garden. They're kind of just pointless if they just sit around and do nothing. But they start to mean something when you begin to reflect on them. When you're like, oh, I remember when this happened, when we went on this vacation. Let me give you a couple of examples. Have you ever been at a funeral? Maybe it's like the reception of the funeral. You're talking and you're just sharing memories of this person who had passed, and you're laughing. Like you're reflecting on those moments, and it provides even more value and more. I guess I don't really know the word I'm looking for, but it provides something more than just that moment. When you begin to reflect on who that person was and what they did and all the things that they accomplished and the memories you had with them, it makes it all the more special, right? Let me give you another example. Have you ever been like cleaning your room or a garage, and all of a sudden you come across something from your childhood? Maybe it was an old craft project, art project that your mom kept for you. Let me give you something weird. My mom kept my baby teeth, and the other day she gave them to me. But have you ever been like, yeah, I'm just going to brush past that because white people are weird, but, and they keep weird things. But I think this is a common experience. We find these old things, and then we begin to reflect on them and remember, oh, I remember back in first grade when I did this project and how fun it was. Like they're just items, but they're more than items when you reflect on them. They're memories. They're the reason that you are who you are today. So rocks are great, but they're useless unless you reflect on the rocks. In the example of the Israelites in the Bible, in the story of Joshua, they could have set up a memorial never to look at it again, never to think about it again. But the whole point of a memorial is to look at it and to think about it and to think on it and to meditate upon it and to constantly think, okay, if God did it once, God can do it again. The whole point of the memorial was for them to tell their children and their children to tell their children's children of what God has done in this moment. There's a whole idea of Passover. Tell your children what God has done for you today. Write it on the door, like write it everywhere. Keep it on your hearts, on your minds. It's just a rock unless you reflect on it. And when you reflect on it, it can be a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness, of God's power, of God's presence in your life. So maybe today, take some time to reflect upon the rocks in your life. For me, I'll tell you some rocks that I constantly reflect on. Every time I drive by a Subway restaurant, like the sandwich shop, I reflect because it's a rock for me. I remember vividly when I felt the call to go into ministry, I met with my lead pastor at a Subway, and he made a bunch of he made statements to me that are still in my mind today about going into ministry and about following the call of God on my life. And every time I begin to doubt the call of God on my life, I go back to that very conversation where my pastor affirmed the call of God on my life, and he began to pour into me and share his wisdom with me. And so every time I'm doubting, I reflect on that rock. I drive by Safeway. I'm like, I remember when God called me into ministry and I met at that Subway. It don't matter where I'm at. I could be in another city. I could be in another state. But if I see a Subway, guess what I'm thinking about? That conversation with my pastor and the call to ministry that I have and God's faithfulness as I followed the call to ministry. Like I'm always thinking, what are my rocks? Okay, what are your rocks? Is it a place? Is it an item? Is it an object? I'll never forget this. I'll tell you this story because it was so encouraging to me. A couple months ago, I was driving over to a meeting, and a lot of times when I get to have some extended drive time, I was driving to another city about half an hour away, and I was praying to God, and I was just expressing, my doubt in the call of God I had. I said, God, do you really want me to be a youth pastor for the rest of my life? And I said this statement to God. I said, God, am I really called to ministry? Like I could go do something else. I could go make a lot more money. Like that's where I was at. I said, God, am I really called? And I prayed this, and I don't normally pray stuff like this, but I said, God, like I need you to speak to me. I need you to confirm this call in me. Even though he already had multiple times in my life, I was just having a moment of doubt and a real authentic moment with God. And the very next day, I go to speak at this chapel at the Christian school here in my community, and I was speaking to fourth through sixth graders. Actually, it was fourth grade through high school. But at the end of chapel, these fourth graders came and handed me some cards that they had drawn for me and written for me before chapel had happened, just as a way to say thank you for coming to speak at chapel, which was awesome. And so I go out to my car, I collect all these cards after chapel, and I'm reading through them and I'm skimming through them. And one card catches my attention, and it said this on the very front of it. It said, Pastor Austin, you really are called. And that blew my mind. I said, first of all, what fourth grader uses the language, you really are called? Second of all, these were the exact words that I prayed the day before, and God was confirming that call of God on my life. He was confirming what he had called me to do years ago. And so here's what I could have done. I could have taken that as a coincidence and said, well, of course, I'm at a Christian school, just going to say things like that. No other card said anything like that. So for me, I was in tears in my car because God was confirming the call in my life. And so I have that card hanging up in my office, just right over there, actually. And when I look at it, I'm reminded that God did call me to do this. When times get tough, when ministry gets hard, when it gets busy, when seasons change and ebb and flow, I look at that card and I say, God, thank you for the call on my life. I'm constantly reflecting on that rock. What are the rocks in your life? Maybe it's the moment you got saved. Maybe it's the moment God healed you. Maybe it's a moment that God provided something for you. Maybe it's the moment. It could be so many different things. Reflect right now. What are those moments for you? And lastly, not only should we reflect on the rocks to assure us of what we're doing and to strengthen our faith, but the third point I want to make is this, that rocks are prophetic. Rocks are prophetic. Here's what I mean, and I think it's kind of obvious, but not only do rocks tell of what God has done, they tell of what God is going to do and what he's capable of doing again in the future. In the Bible, up to this point of the story, when Joshua walks through the Jordan River on dry ground, this is the second time that God split a body of water. And it would actually happen 2 more times in the Bible, to Elijah and then again to Elisha. They would both walk through the Jordan River on dry ground. And what I love is they would have heard these stories of Moses and of Joshua walking through, and they would have seen that memorial or heard of that memorial, and they would have said, if God did it then, he could do it now. And of course, they got to see it in their lifetime, because not only do rocks describe, but they tell of what God can do again. They are almost prescriptive sometimes, and they're prophetic to say, God did it once, he can do it again. And to be honest, I think many of us need to look at rocks in our lives and even in the lives of others. Here's the thing. When God moves in, maybe you've struggled with this because I've struggled with this, which is comparison. In my faith journey, I'll see God doing something for somebody else. I'll see the way he moves and provides and does all sorts of crazy things for other people. And I start to think, God, why not me? Like, why are you doing all these things for other people but not me? And I need to change my perspective, and maybe you do too if you struggle with comparison. Instead of getting upset and thinking, God, why are you doing it for them? Change your perspective and say, God, if you did it for them, you can do it for me. If you can give them this rock per se, you can do it for me. God, thank you that you're so powerful that you've done it for them and that you can do it for me. But maybe you have depression and anxiety and you've seen God heal them. It's time to pray, do it again in me, God. Maybe you're addicted and you've heard stories of how God has set people free. It's time to pray, do it again, but in me. It's time to say that rocks are prophetic. Maybe you've seen somebody get healed of a disease or a sickness or an illness that you have, and you're ready for your time. Instead of getting angry and mad at God that he did it for them, say, God, I've seen you do it for them. God, would you do it in me? Not in a jealous way, not in an angry way, but in a way that says, God, I know you are powerful and I know that you can. I love rocks. Rocks are prophetic. Rocks help us. They edify us. They strengthen us. These stories of what God has done in our life are beautiful when we reflect on them, when we collect them. I pray that only as I get older, that my rock collection will be huge, that I'll just have so many stories I can pull off the shelf and say, I remember when God healed. I remember when God provided. I remember when God moved. I remember when God sent so-and-so to my life. Like, I just want to have so many stories of the things that God has done that I'll never have a question or I'll never have a doubt because I got so many rocks to answer every doubt and every question that I ever could have. So I encourage you today, what are your rocks? If you don't have any, reflect on your life, and I bet you can find some, even just in reflection on what God has done for you and where you're at this point in your life. Maybe you've never noticed that God has moved in your life, but I bet as you look back, you can be like, I see God's handiwork in that. I see how God took me out of this situation, even though I really wanted to be there. I see how God actually brought me to this promotion or brought me to this city when I wanted to be somewhere. Like, you can look back and see how God has moved in so many ways. Find some rocks. Go to the river. I don't know. There's rocks down there. Anyway, hey, that's all I got for this particular message. I hope that you find some rocks to remember. I'm going to be right back at it again with another episode. I'm going to record another episode right after this one. So hopefully this one will come out There'll be a couple coming out right in a row. All right. So I'll see you next time on the next episode of the Life Podcast. We'll see you then.